talk about non-skid application a little bit now. There's any number of different ways of applying non-skid, and there's no real right or wrong way of doing it, but I'm going to go through a few of the various application techniques and the mediums that we use, and then I'm going to show everybody exactly what we do on the luxury boat, which is what we specialise in, of course, and use generally. Non-skid comes in pre-mixed form sometimes. You can get non-skid that's mixed up in the paint shop, but generally it comes in particle form, and it comes in international standard grades, from extra fine, fine, coarse, extra coarse, and then the mediums just get bigger and bigger, right up to basically ball bearing size. You can use gravel, sugar, salt, anything basically. But of course, when we get into the more technical jobs and jobs that are specified, they're a specified particle size, and they're available through the reputable marine suppliers, and that's generally what we use. You can apply it in any number of different ways. You can roll it, basically mix the particle straight in with the paint, roll it on a roller tray, just roll it out over your mast surface, and it is a reasonable application. It gives you a non-skid finish, which achieves all your non-skid qualities, but it's a little bit inconsistent. We don't like to do it that way very often, but a lot of people do, a lot of do-it-yourself guys do. You can lay wet paint down on your surface, get a bead blaster, which we sometimes do with the more commercial finishes. Just spray your non-skid out on top of the wet paint. You can sieve it out onto your wet paint. There's any number of ways. You can even hand apply it like your feeding chooks. So there's any number of ways of doing it. But the first thing you have to do is mask and prepare your surface for the application of the non-skid. So what we'll do now is show you the techniques involved in masking up a deck panel, and then we'll get into the applications and some of the more finer detail. Now, here we have a small fiberglass panel off the deck of a boat. It'll be hard for me to show you on a big area, so we're going to do it this way. Now, we have about a 25-30 mil border on this particular panel, and that's fairly consistent in luxury boats. You have a gloss border with non-skid in the middle, so that the crew can run around on the deck, not slip off the edges. They've got things to grab onto with their feet as they're trying to clean the boat and work on the boat, drag fish in, whatever they're doing. Now, when choosing your tape or whatever you're using to form your border, try and consider what you're going to face at the end of the job. You don't want to just use a standard masking tape when you're doing non-skid, primarily because they have a very thin profile. When you've finished applying all your non-skid, you've got a big, thick paint profile on top of your tape. Makes it very hard to demask. You need a fairly strong tape in order to rip your masking off at the end without the paint film tearing away from either the paint surface or you're not being able to get the tape off. So we usually use quite a thick PVC tape, and then basically drag out, mark our surface out. This one's quite easy and quite straightforward, so we'll just run it out. You can imagine how to mask it out. You get a template, use your 30mm border, run lines down, and then mark it out. So we do all your straights first. This one's already marked out, so it's fairly simple. Just being careful to make sure all your lines are nice and straight. No one likes looking at awkward, crooked lines on the boat after the application. Fairly good. And the corners are the difficult part. Anyone can run lines on nice long straights. There's two basic ways of doing your corners. If you've got a really flexible fine line tape, you can put them straight on and bend the tape with pressure as you're putting the masking down, and make the bend with the tape. Okay, the second way to do a radius in a corner is if the radius is too tight, it's going to be very, very difficult to bend any sort of tape around the radius, and the tape will want to wrinkle up off the finished surface on the outside. There's not a lot of adhesion there for the tape. We'll want to wrinkle up if it's pulled too tight, and the tapes can pull and lose their shape too. So quite often what we'll do is just lay the tape completely over the corner altogether, then using a template for the radiuses on all the different corners, which in this case is just a 20-cent piece, you lay the template back in to the corner on top of the masking tape, mark it, and then with a razor blade, very carefully and gently, only trying to cut through the tape, not trying to cut into the paint here. That's the key. You don't want a big groove in the corner where the paint's going to sit down in and the paint's going to want to run through the groove and under your tape. Just very gently, following the lines you've just made off your template, just cutting through the tape. You run around the radius. Gently flip the tape up, peel the unwanted tape off, and your radius is there. Yeah, that actually forms usually a flatter, better masked radius, because you haven't got any real chance of it cutting up, because you haven't put any tension on the tape and pulled it around. The only thing you've got to be careful of is not scoring the finished paintwork with the razor blade. Okay, once you've done all that, you've got to key up the surface, which has been prepared. This one's actually very nice, it's got a full coat of paint on it already. You've got to make sure that the 320 grit or the 240 grit that you prepare this non-skid surface up with is prepared right to the very edge of the tape. There's no point of doing all this and making a nice edge and not having a keyed surface for the paint to adhere to right to the edge, because when you pull your tape off, there's going to be no adhesion around the edge of the masking, and it's going to pull all the paint off next to the tape line and give you a ragged edge where it's all pulled up, and it's very unprofessional and not satisfactory. So that's how you mask them up generally. You go into it all day making big curves and things are a lot more complicated, but that's generally the idea, and that's the two different ways of doing a corner. Then we basically exclude all the finished paintwork by extending our masking with wider tape out past the fine line edge, so the paint can't get onto any of the finished surface around the edge. You see that all this has been prepared earlier, the backs are masked off. Generally finish all the corners, mask it off, and key sand right next to the edge, key sand all in the middle, and we're ready to go. So then we'll get into some paint mixing, show you how to get the particle into the paint, onto the job as best we can. I'll just finish this off then, baby. Alright, we've got all our panels prepared up, ready to spray with our non-skid. We've got to make a decision about what we're going to use to apply the non-skid paint with. Now, each different style of spray gun has its advantages and disadvantages in regards to non-skid. Whenever we get a chance, we will try and use a gravity-fed gun, because basically the consistency of the paint with the non-skid particle in it doesn't really lend itself to having pressure on the paint. It moves the particles around inside the mixed paint, and you get inconsistency in the amount of particle that comes through. With gravity-fed, as long as you haven't got the non-skid mixed into your paint too long before you start applying, it seems to just let it come through very gradually. If you mix it too early and you let all the non-skid start to sink to the bottom, it'll tend to clog up the neck of your gun, and you'll get all the non-skid at the first half of your pot and all paint in the second. So as long as you keep the addition of the non-skid until right at the end when you're ready to paint, quite a simple way to go with the gravity fed. There's a couple of little problems with it in the actual application, but I'll explain that when I start to paint, because that's what we're going to use today. The suction fed gun is pretty simple for non-skid, but it does struggle with the venturi action of the suction fed gun to get the non-skid up and out. It really works a little bit hard, so we don't very often use a suction fed gun for that. The pressure pots are a bit hairy for non-skid applications, but very effective on very big areas where you can really get a fan spread out and get going in a hurry. So on real big decks, sort of need to use a pressure pot to get the application done in a suitable period of time. So the only problem with it is though, of course, with a pressure pot, the pressure is pushing the paint to the tip constantly and relies on the tip sealing off when you take your finger off the trigger to stop the paint coming out. Of course, when the paint pot is full of non-skid particles, very hard for the tip to seal with the non-skid particles in the way of the tip. So of course you get a lot of squirting where your tip won't seal, a lot of drips out of your tip, very messy. You try and set your job up so that you don't have to take your finger off the trigger very often on a big non-skid job when you're using a pressure pot. But for simple panels like this, we're going to use a gravity fed today, and I'll show you the problems with that a bit later and the benefits as well. It should go pretty smooth. Okay, we're pretty much ready to go now. We've got some Aldred linear polyurethane mixed up in our gravity fed gun. We try to use linear polyurethane as opposed to acrylic modified polyurethane as much as we can with non-skid, because it's a bit tougher. You're never going to be able to buff and repair non-skid anyway. The linear is more suitable for the task. When you're adding your non-skid to your paint, there's no fixed ratio of particle to paint. Every job's different once again, and depending on how you lay it out as to how much particle you get per square inch or however you want to gauge it. But this particular instance, we're going to use coarse Griptex US Paints non-skid. We're going to mix it about 40 to 1. Now, there's no rule of thumb, but between sort of 20 and 50 to 1 is your addition of non-skid particle to paint. And that's just worked out on volume. So we're going to go ahead and do it at that, and you sort of keep your eye on it as you're applying it, and you can always slow your hand speed down a little bit or put a little bit more paint on as you go, especially if it's just horizontal stuff, if you want a little bit more particle in your paint. You can of course have a look after you put one light application on to see how much you've got in it. You can always go over it and put some more on. But there are some issues with that too. When you're on a big deck, you really only get one go at it, because you can't usually walk back on top of your deck to put another coat on. Usually you'll be putting a coat of non-skid down, walking off, waiting a day, coming back, putting a sealer coat over the top. So there are a few different problems, but I'll just get some mixing gear and get this non-skid in. Okay, we're basically ready to go now. A couple of little things to remember. If these panels had all been prepped up and there were some imperfections in them, they had some polyester fills in them, or a cut through to a darker colour underneath, now's the time to go through with some paint, go around and spot them up for coverage. Now, you're not going to get a chance to spot them up for coverage with the non-skid in the gun, because you can't really fiddle around and fan the trigger and just puff in little patches. You go around and put all your coverage stuff on first. These are all prepared beautifully and they've got lots of colour on them. There's no real need for us to do it, but this is the time to do it if you have to. We're going to mix this particle in with the paint now. As I described earlier, you do it right at the very end so that the particle doesn't settle in the paint. You're going to stir it right in the canister on the top of the gun. There's no time to muck around with it off the job in tins or anything. Straight in there, stir it up. The only problem with application of non-skid through a gravity fed gun is that sometimes, usually, especially with coarse, you'll see a bit of spray pattern in the non-skid particle. So you'll notice when I spray it that I'm going to apply it one way and then I'm going to turn and apply it the other way to try and break up that spray pattern that you can get from spraying non-skid through a gravity fed gun. Basically the air can't quite spread the non-skid particle out as consistently as the paint. It's a lot heavier. So it tends to just put it in the middle and the outside just got paint on it, so you can see the pattern that your hand runs through the job. Now I put a first application on there. I can see straight away that I haven't got quite enough particle on that surface for the first coat. So now I can go back and adjust and put a little bit more particle in the paint and just waft some more over the top. That's why it's very important if you're doing a really big area that you do a bit of a sample panel first, check out the pattern that you're achieving, make sure you're right before you get on that great big boat and start wafting this stuff out. You're not going to get the chance to go back and put a bit more on. Okay, now we've got a beautiful, consistent, non-skid surface, and we're going to leave that. In this condition here, we can leave that for probably an hour or two, then come back, put a sealer coat over the outside, and it's done. If we're up on a big boat where we have to walk back on top of the surface, we'd have to leave it for probably 12 or 13 hours at 25 degrees to walk gently back over the surface and put our sealer coat over. But here we can pretty much just go straight over it as soon as the paint sets up again. So that's what we're going to do, and we'll show you how to demask it a bit later. Okay, we've got our consistent coat of non-skid on here now. We've got no coverage issues, everything's sweet. All we've got to do now is put a sealer coat over the top, just to protect the tops of the particles with a bit of paint so that wear and tear from people's feet, whatever gets dragged across the deck doesn't wear the paint off the top of the particles too quickly. So all we're going to do is just put one coat of paint straight over the top, no tricks. Okay, that's all we have to do. Non-skid job's finished, later on we'll demask it. Okay, we're going to demask this little panel now. There's just a few little traps. It would appear pretty simple, and it is generally, but if you're demasking non-skid, it's a good idea if you can to try and demask it while the paint's still damp. There's less chance of a bridge forming from the non-skid onto the tape and it forming a nice hard bridge that will want to chip the paint away from the edge. If it's damp, it sort of just peels away quite easily. And of course, sometimes you haven't got that option available to you. But there's a couple of techniques in demasking that helps you from having it damage itself as well. Get all the extra here we go, it's come straight away anyway. If you try and tear the masking back away from the edge of the non-skid at 45 degrees, don't try and pull it over the top of the non-skid and pull it that way, it'll tend to tear the paint away. You're better off if you have a little bit of residual come over on the existing paint that you can just wipe off or buff off than if you tear non-skid off. It's very hard to repair. So just peel the tape back at 45 degrees to the non-skid surface like so,
and take it back like that. If the non-skid is damp, which it still is here, be careful that you don't just let your masking flap back onto the non-skid that's damp. It might stick in there and cause damage. But more or less that's all there is to it other than that.